Hi, Ian. Welcome to Listen.Better podcast for today. Thanks so much for taking time out of your undoubtedly busy schedule with COVID and Brexit high on the agenda. And for the FDF, of course, they're very, very important issues for you. Could you just start off by saying a little bit about your role when you joined the FDF and the work of the FDF before we get into some of the meatier issues, perhaps?
Sure, delighted to do that. And thank you for having me. I've been Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation since March of 2015. The FDF is the representative voice of food manufacturers across the country, across Great Britain. We have a sister organisation in the United Kingdom, but we have FDF Scotland and FDF Cymru in those countries. We have over 800 members, actually approaching 900 members in food manufacturing. We represent everything from sole traders right the way through to the largest food and drink companies in the world. And our role is really twofold. It's advisory and advocacy. So we spend probably most of our time advising members on a range of issues, from technical issues like labeling, ingredients, all the way through to labour law, how you manage your workforce, and trade issues, and of course they take you directly to Brexit.
Yes, the B word, and of course we've got the C word. So on the day of recording, we're waiting to hear with COVID whether London goes into tier 3, which is clearly going to have a massive impact on hospitality, and we're waiting to see if the Brexit no deal or deal is going to come through. So your phone and email must be absolutely humming at the moment, Ian. Let's break those into two subjects. So COVID first. Going back to March, what was your reaction when you knew the first lockdown was coming? What did you think you were going to have to do for members and your team?
Well, I have to say, it had never occurred to me before about the 23rd of March that it was possible for government to close whole sections of the economy. And I still actually question whether it was the right thing to do. Indeed, I'm pretty sure it was the wrong thing to do. But there was safety in the government doing what everybody else had done. My first thought and my first task was to make sure that food and drink manufacturing stayed open. We knew that we would probably be designated as key workers if the department which sponsors us, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, had its way. But we knew there would be a battle, and we had to explain to government at the very highest levels the consequence of closing food manufacturing, which was that the nation would run out of food within about a week. And once that had, and you'd think it was kind of blindingly obvious, but actually to certain people it wasn't. Once we'd made that clear, I think we were able to make quite a good fist of the regulations. We had, I remember, a huge amount of trouble working out what you did about workplace canteens. But those sorts of practical things were fairly quickly overcome. But it's easy to forget that in the early days of this crisis, some of our members were facing absentee or absence rates of over 20%, because some people had to stay at home to look after elderly relatives or after their school kids. Some were self-isolating. There was much less known about the disease at that point. And the consequence of that was that they had to take very speedy and radical action to get themselves into a position to continue to produce the same amount of food and drink, but in fairly significantly reduced variants. So one of my members, very famous big company, on the day that the Prime Minister announced the lockdown, had 85 stock keeping units, individual variant products. And by the end of that week, they were down to 10. That's the biggest transformation this industry has ever seen. And the other thing that happened during that period was that the 30% of consumption, which is normally accounted for by out of home, sandwich shops, contract catering and hospitality, simply walked across the road to supermarkets. So by the end of March, 95% of consumption was through retail. And that had big impacts on the availability of food for about a week. It wasn't that there was no food in the pipeline, it was simply that you couldn't replenish the shelves fast enough. But very quickly, the industry recovered through our colleagues in retail and through manufacturing. And I think we've done a pretty good job on supplying the nation and keeping it fed and watered through the crisis.
Mm. So with hindsight, which is always a marvellous thing, what would you have done differently on the basis that you're responding to your members? You are the federation representing your members. And I assume you've spent a lot of time talking to them, consulting with them. Would you have done anything differently? And of course, I guess you have to play a steady political line here where you fall with that. But what's your personal view?
Yes, I think we might have engaged a bit more to keep hospitality venues open. And I think this would have been very controversial. But my view is that after the initial lockdown, I think it's difficult to argue that you could have done much to mitigate that. I think we did all we could to make sure that food and drink was properly preserved and its supply was properly preserved during that period. I think thereafter we should have argued more strongly for a different approach to hospitality, because I think this is going to have two consequences. First of all, the hospitality in this industry, the hospitality industry in this country is totally stuffed. I think somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the pubs and bars in this country may very well close for good in the next few weeks. If they don't have a successful Christmas, if London is locked down, there is a very large preponderance of it there. And those people will simply not come back unless the government radically changes its support for them. And I think what they have to do is not fiddle about with furlough schemes and £1,000 grants. They have to guarantee the turnover of those businesses for the next 3 months. If they don't do that, they won't be there afterwards. And that will mean about 2 million people will be unemployed and shoveled onto the unemployment list. The alternative to that, and it's absolutely a realistic one, is to close universities and make them learn online. Because the reason that hospitality is closed, according to the government, is that the transmission of the disease is amplified by people being together. About the same number of people are together in universities. So it's one or the other. It's a straight choice. And for me, I would opt for economic activity over universities where it's perfectly possible for those people to learn online, and the actual economic costs of closing universities are far less serious for a year, far less serious than the ones for hospitality. Now, I realise that's an extremely controversial thing to do, but I think that would be the economically right thing to do. The only thing I would say is if they don't do that, you have to begin to conclude that there is a bit of a different agenda in government, at least at the heart of the NHS. And I think they are actually secretly pursuing an anti-alcohol agenda. And I think it would be remiss of me not to call that out. I think there is an agenda in the NHS that somehow alcohol is bad. They've got a very strong platform now because they can show, or they believe they can show, that obesity is a driving force of COVID. And I think they're probably right that they have to tackle obesity. And I think that has led them into a rather careless attitude to hospitality. I think they think it's frivolous and discretionary. And I think they're about to find out from the tax take that it's absolutely crucial to the nation's economy.
Wow, this is hard-hitting stuff, Ian. I'm really grateful for your candidness around this. How do you tread a line when you've got members, presumably with quite a wide range of views on the same subject? And as a membership body, you have to represent all your members. How do you square that off? How do you set about getting a representative voice from all your members?
Well, I don't think you can, actually. I think you have to try. I mean, there are two ways you can run a representative organisation. One is you can go lowest common denominator and only do the things to which people agree. The other is that you can do what we've done over Brexit, not so much over COVID, actually, but over Brexit, which is to say, this is what some of our members think, this is what others think, and to present the case in that way. So with what I've just said about universities, I'm sure a lot of members wouldn't agree, and many more wouldn't agree publicly, because that would potentially be unpopular. But I do think it's important to present the alternative cases. So of course, with what I've just said, there's a very good case to keep universities open. But it is the case that universities can be open virtually and pubs can't. And it seems to me that that is something which has been ignored. Now, we've done the same sort of thing over Brexit to talk about what the alternatives are in terms of what can be done with the UK outside the EU and outside any kind of free trade agreement with the EU, and what can't. And it's really about explaining the consequences of different courses of action and how they will be visited on our members. And that's the best we can do to represent their interests.
Thank you. And so we've come to Brexit very neatly. Thank you for that. So we'll have Remainers and Leavers as part of your membership too. We're waiting on 10 hooks to find out if there's going to be a deal or no deal. What would a no deal mean for your members?
Well, there are two stages of this. So whatever happens on over the next few days, on the 31st of December at 23:01, our members will have a whole range of checks that they have to now go through for exports and for imports. So food going from this country into the EU or coming from the EU into this country will be subject to the same sorts of checks that food leaving this country to go anywhere outside the EU have been facing for decades. And similarly, importers from outside the EU have faced coming into this country. So that means checks on animal health, on plant health. It means customs checks. It means driver checks. It means export certificates. It means a whole range of bureaucracy that we don't currently face. That adds cost, it adds delay, and it adds disruption. It adds cost because all of those processes take time to fill in and to deliver. It adds delay because there will be checks at the ports, and it doesn't matter if your paperwork is in order. It's the question of what the person in front of you in the queue has, and if they're not ready, they will be turned around. That will take time, and delay will occur. And it causes disruption because that will have random impacts on the availability of particular brands in particular places. The whole of the food system, as has been very well illustrated through COVID, has been built on just-in-time principle. So food is now delivered into the UK on an hourly basis. It's moved to distribution centres. It's moved from the distribution centres straight onto the shelf, and it often arrives on shelf fewer than 12 and sometimes fewer than 8 hours after it's come into the country. That won't be possible in some cases as a consequence of those disruptions. If there's a no deal outcome to all of the discussions, then on top of that, you have to layer tariffs or taxes on imports and exports. So for importers, there will be taxes that the UK levies on food coming into the country, designed to protect us against the ravages of dumping from foreign countries, and those will add cost. So particularly well kind of versed example over the last few days has been cheese. It could be brie, it could be fromage frais. The tariff on fromage frais coming in from the EU is 150%. So that cost will obviously rise. Similarly, the tariff on brie from France is 40%. Again, that cost will rise. The implications of that are that presumably shoppers will then be asked to decide whether they want to pay extra for that product. If they do decide they want to pay extra for that product, they'll do so. But I imagine that what retailers will do is afford less shelf space to the expensive products on the basis that many people are governed by price, and they will look for substitutes. Those substitutes, which would have to be British produced, will probably be available in less numbers immediately, although some will have been prepared for this outcome. And therefore, there may be shortages. They will also, if they are available, they will almost certainly be, although lower cost, they'll be in cost quite close to the outcome cost of post-tariff cost of some of the products they're substituting, because that's business. If you can see that your competitor is pricing at 100, then your best guess is probably to price at 90 or 95 in order to undercut the competitor, but still take a margin. So I think that is what will happen, and therefore prices will rise fairly significantly. I would say by up to 20 or 30% in some cases, but only on the items which are replaced.
And the time frame for that, Ian?
Mid-January. I don't think there'll be price rises straight away because all those products are already here and they haven't paid the tariffs. And in some cases, slow burn products will be in the distribution centres for days, possibly weeks, before they come out. So I think you could expect to see those rises in place by the end of January. And it doesn't necessarily mean just because the price rises between the provider or supplier and the retailer that the price goes up immediately on shelf. So retailers have their own promotional programs which are in place. They'll probably work their way through what they call the planogram for this period, and then move into the new price regime into late January, early February. But I know that most of our members are sending out letters today or this week to explain their new price structure in the event of tariff supply.
Gosh, January 2021. I thought we were going to be able to put this year behind us and have a fresh start, but no, there's more coming. What about, more personally speaking, Ian, around your approach to leadership and how you've led the Federation? What have you learned this year, do you think?
Well, I've learned a lot, actually. I've learned that you can do things that you never thought were possible. So it had never occurred to me that hospitality was discretionary, and it is. And that is a big, for someone who spent 14 years in the booze trade, that is a really big and significant concern. I think but on a grander scale, I think it's about the fact that you really do have to challenge your assumptions. I've learned that it's possible to work remotely. I don't like it, but it certainly is a way of doing things. I do think I don't buy the notion that we're all more productive working at home. I think it is the case that people individually are more productive in the sense that they get through their to-do list. But as a collective, I think we are somewhat less creative. We're certainly less convivial. It's less fun. And I also think that over time, what we do see, and what I've seen in a number of organisations, both in mine and our members, is that you have to spend a lot of time making sure people stick to the direction that you've set. Otherwise, you get kind of very, very small, but quite often cumulative movements away from the core activities. And by 3 months or 6 months later, you are going in one direction and some of your team are off in a you're going north and they're somewhere northeast. And that is, I think, quite a dangerous thing. Another thing I've learned is that we're not very good at managing performance remotely. We're very, very good, I think. It's quite a good mechanism for engaging to give praise. Not brilliant, actually, because I think people do sort of switch off. I think they discount about 20 to 25% of the message. But I think it's extremely difficult. I don't know if I can say this on your podcast, but I will anyway, and then you can delete it if you don't like. It's extremely difficult to deliver a bollocking on Zoom or Teams or whatever. And the consequence of that is that you don't do it, and that you pull your punches, and that you wait for the in-person meeting, which in some cases has never come. And I think that's quite a difficult situation. And it's because we are not trained to do this. And we are also rightly, I think, extremely concerned about the impact of our words when we can't judge them in person. And I think that's a real problem for all of us. And I don't know that I've yet come across a solution for it. The other thing is you never stop working. I mean, the phone is on 24/7. People feel apparently perfectly legitimized to call you late into the evening, early hours of the morning, early, way before normal business time, and over the weekend. There is no escape. And although we are in a national crisis, probably the worst national crisis since 1939, even so, I think we need some new rules of engagement. I have never ever in my life worked harder. I haven't had a day off where I've done no work since the 23rd of March. There hasn't been a single day when I haven't done 3 or 4 hours work. And frankly, I'm completely exhausted. And this is not a good way to be going into what is going to be an even more difficult time if there's a no-deal Brexit, because there will be chaos.
I was going to say, how are you going to approach 2021 now that you've shared those extraordinary list of long learnings? How are you going to sustain this? Because I can see it in your face. You are exhausted, and you've admitted it. That is full-on work schedule since March 23rd. How can you pull back and actually save something for yourself so that you can actually be perhaps a more effective leader?
Well, I can't, not until the crisis is over, because we're now right in the middle of it. I mean, we have to wait for the no deal Brexit to be told. We have to wait for the news of whether there is or isn't a no deal Brexit. And incidentally, some of that leaves you in the ludicrous position that businesses are having to prepare for 2 completely different eventualities without any real compass as to how that's going to go. And there's also the really balmy thing, and I think this is almost inconceivable, but it is going to happen. When we start, whatever happens, when we start trading on December the 31st at 23:01, nobody is going to be able to access the rules under which they're trading. They just won't have been published. They won't have been scrutinized. There will be no set of rules. People will be able to guess at them, but there'll be no established corpus of law that anybody can consult. So it's an Alice in Wonderland world that we're going into. And I think that is really perturbing. It's perturbing for 2 reasons. One is you can't possibly know what's right or what's wrong. You just have to guess. But the other is it breeds a kind of contempt for the rules, the law, the structure in which we operate, which long-term must be very damaging for stability in our society. And I don't think the government has given anything like enough thought to that problem and to the way in which it really leaves business leaders and business managers in a truly impossible position. Most of my members who are international businesses have to sign compliance certificates on an annual basis. Those certificates say I have complied with rules and regulations that apply to the territories in which I manage operations. And if you don't do that, you have to give a long explanation of why you may not have been able to do so. And in most cases, if you do that, you'll be dinged on your bonus, or even lose your bonus. Well, actually, it's almost impossible to sign a compliance certificate in the current circumstances. And you may say, and others may say, well, does that really matter? And for some, it doesn't. But if you're working in a business that is either domiciled in the EU or in the US or in some other jurisdictions, those jurisdictions can come after you, even though the offence you may have potentially inadvertently committed wasn't committed against a business from that jurisdiction or in that jurisdiction. So I'm in the position where I've had this experience 10 years ago in my life, when a business I worked for had done something wrong inadvertently. They didn't know they'd done it. They didn't know the individual concerned had done it until another individual confessed to it a decade later. And then we were investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. And that investigation involved me being deposed by a lawyer from the SEC for 7 hours And in that case, the only reason I was being deposed was that I was on about 25 emails as a CC. I had no knowledge of the actual incident. These emails simply came from the person concerned. Later, they had nothing to do with the incident. So I was deposed for 7 hours. And the cost after all the mitigations and all the legal activity to my business was £80 million. And this was for an offence that had been for under £10,000 of value. Utterly extraordinary. If you were sitting, and everyone I know who's ever worked for a big international company has a horror story like that. And if you were sitting and having to sign your compliance certificate after the events on the 31st of December, you'd be very, very wary of being caught in that sort of trap. And I don't think government remotely understands these sorts of considerations, because almost nobody in government has ever had a proper job.
That is a phenomenal case study to share. Thanks, Ian. And I think this is going
I'm not sure you'll want to, but anyway.
No, I will be. It's so important to hear these voices, because we have the media headlines, but we need to know what the real sentiment and what the real impact is and the practicalities of this. So thanks so much, Ian, for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I know your members will be hugely grateful for the incredibly hard work you're putting in along with your team. And we'll be sharing this shortly. Thank you.